Welcome to our 5th episode on Reach Minds Thoughts for Our Life Journey podcast. In this podcast, we will be exploring the dynamics of shame, why and when it occurs, and what strategies could we have in both recognizing and managing shames in our lives. As we know, shame is all around us, it's inside of us and in between us. Now, I'm not a stranger to the word shame itself. I first came across it with the work of Brené Brown. However, where my eyes really opened up around shame was when I was doing the work at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations when I was attending my supervision course and working with Eliat Aram. Through her teaching and reading about shame, I went, wow, this is an amazing, wide subject that I hadn't even occurred. Now, Dr. Eliat Aram is the CEO of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, and she's been there 16 years. She's also a Chartered Psychologist with the BPS, which is the British Psychological Society, and a UKCP registered Gestalt and Humanistic therapist. So I'm not going to add any more. I'm going to hand over to Eliat, and I'd like her to begin to put into context the poem that really touched, the extract that really touched to my bone from Winnie the Pooh. Eliat, over to you.
Thank you, Nita. Nice to be here. We're here, as you said, to talk about shame. I would like to start from saying that shame has been how should I put it, my core work and exploration from when I did my doctorate back in 2001. So my doctorate thesis is based on understanding the dynamics of shame as an integral part of any learning process, which has the potential of transformation. And arguably, any relearning is transformative. Hence, I've developed the hypothesis that shame is an integral part of that process. And in that, the uniqueness of thinking about shame and shame dynamics is that in my hypothesis proposition and way of working with it, it's not only a negative. In fact, it signals that there is a newness emerging in the understanding, mostly around identity and questions of identity. When I started to introduce the work around shame, which I always felt rather sensitive about, as you probably can vouch from the experience of being spoken to about that on the program, is quite rattling and moving. Mm-hmm. It's not only exciting and positive. So when I first started, I was thinking, okay, how do I best set a container for that process? And then what I have found myself doing is what I often do, is go to what are considered children's books, but have had the reputation and the experience of being very allegorical and symbolic at the same time. And I usually turn to Alice in Wonderland or Winnie the Pooh. And in Winnie the Pooh, I found the following extract that I thought, yes, this is what we need when we talk and explore shame. We need a friend. Today was a difficult day, said Pooh. There was a pause. Do you want to talk about it? Asked Piglet. No, said Pooh after a bit. No, I don't think I do. That's okay, said Piglet, and he came and sat beside his friend. What are you doing? Asked Pooh. Nothing really, said Piglet. Only I know what difficult days are like. I quite often don't feel like talking about it on my difficult days either. But goodness, continued Piglet, difficult days are so much easier when you know you've got someone there for you. And I'll always be here for you, Pooh. And as Pooh sat there, working through in his head his difficult day, while the solid, reliable Piglet sat next to him quietly, swinging his little legs, he thought that his best friend had never been more right.
Ooh, that still rumbles me in my gut. It really touches every bone of inside of me, and I just think it's so amazing. And just listening to you now just made me think about the connection with having a friend even more powerfully. The more so now than actually when even reading it myself. This is amazing. And so I want to pick up from there is you spoke about the kind of the dynamic of shame. How would you define the dynamic of shame?
First and foremost, as relational, and that's how shame has always been spoken about in the philosophical and therapeutic literature. Shame, the theory, and I guess that what I'm saying is the experience as well, always arises in relation to an other and the projected or imagined message that other will have about me. So Sartre, for example, the philosopher, spoke about the shame around seeing and being seen, and particularly being seen, and shame around our human need to be seen and the ambivalence that we often carry around that. So we want to be seen, but being seen can also generate feelings of, let's say, embarrassment, because shame is one word, but on the grading scale, embarrassment is also part of the shame dynamic. And on the other extreme, there is humiliation. So when we can abuse that affect and humiliate and feel humiliated when as a tool for exertion of power as well. So it's relational and it's dynamic in the sense that it has at least two sides. And then in the context of the group, it's also paradoxical because we feel it in the body. Shame is something we feel in the body. The most common bodily reaction is blushing. But we cannot and we won't feel it without an other. Maybe an other in the mind, but more often than not, a group of others or at least one other, and maybe somebody in organizational context, maybe the other would more likely to be somebody in position of authority in relation to one.
Yeah, as you're talking, I realize as I was thinking about what got me started around podcast, and it was precisely what was stopping me was shame. And I felt like if I do these podcasts, what would people think? And I had to get past that and I realized it is relational. And in the end, I thought, I don't care. I'm going to do this podcast and it's a learning experience for me and it will be whatever it will be. I got past my own embarrassment and, as you say, even a humiliation. And I thought, I'm going to be out there and someone's going to like it and maybe others won't. So
you must have also had some friends along the way who said, come on, Nita, we'll do it with you. We'll sit by you, next to you.
Absolutely.
Support you.
Absolutely. I had a really great friend called Joseph who encouraged me, who supported me, and he said, go on, do it, go and do it. And you're right. So the Piglet story, absolutely. He was there with me. And I chose him. I could have chosen lots of people. And
maybe he chose you because who, had Piglet just come and sit by him. He didn't ask him to. And I'm also thinking the whole series of podcasts, the way you describe them, and you just said it, I think it encapsulates exactly my theory of shame. It's about learning, and therefore there is all this fear of, am I good enough? Do I know enough to run something like this? How am I going to do it? And then the defenses around shame. Arguably, I don't care is a helpful defense because it helps you mobilize yourself into doing it, but it could have been a hindrance if you didn't have if you didn't have someone to say, oh, that's rubbish, of course they're going to be interesting, because the people that you will bring will have something interesting to say, and they will make you ask more interesting questions even. I think that's exactly it. It's a transformation, because then suddenly, when it's all done and published, you will have to look yourself in the mirror and say, I am Nita, and I'm someone who can do a series of podcasts.
Absolutely, absolutely. If I was to widen it in another way, what role does shame or the understanding of shame play in our culture and in our society, do you think?
Okay, historic or societally. So Norbert Elias wrote about that. He wrote about shame as part, he was a philosopher. He wrote about shame as part of the civilizing process. So it's something around, for example, the boundary, to use a Tavistock concept, the boundary between private and public, for example, is an important boundary to have in order to be able to know what work with as the baby toddler develops into a grown up. They need to learn, we need to learn something about some things you only do in private and something you only do in public. Now, these are related to social acceptable norms. It's not about right or wrong. Maybe it's a wrong system. Maybe we should have all carried on walking around naked, for example, but we're not. And in what is experienced as a civilized society, people wear clothes and hide their private parts. And that is something we learned from when we're toddlers. And unfortunately, we learn it often through having those associated with shame.
Right.
So that is one aspect. And however, where I think it's useful to think about it differently, not only as an aspect of development, I link it to learning, because I think we never really grow out of shame. We never really grow out of shame. It's part of our life. Okay, yeah, I think it's part of our lives no matter what we do. But certainly, if we engage in what we call learning, which is mostly the context where I operate. You know, I'm a therapist, an educator in programs, I'm a consultant. So I'm in that aspect of, let's call them the helping professions, which is about supporting development and growth. And I think shame is an integral part of that.
Yeah. One of the things you said earlier on about shame connected to humiliation or embarrassment. What role do you think guilt plays in comparison to shame?
Yes, so I had a supervisor myself, and I think there's an interesting distinction between shame and guilt, because shame drives a wish to hide. Guilt is about doing something wrong and a wish to confess. Shame is more about triggering a feeling of not being good enough, which is why it's so linked to learning, because when we learn, we have to actually recognize, yes, we are not knowing enough about something or other.
Yeah.
And there are different models of learning. Of course, some of them are more transactional than others. But essentially, it can always be triggered around the not knowing, and therefore I'm not enough, which would be shame. And therefore I want to hide, which is what you were saying about not doing the podcast, because I can't do them. Who am I to do them? And then guilt is actually, I know they often go together and they're often spoken about interchangeably, but I think that they come from very different sources and they therefore have very different solutions. So for me, whilst shame is a mobilizer for change and transformation, guilt is an immobilizer for change and transformation, because guilt brings with it's about doing something wrong. It's very much within a framework of right and wrong. It then links to blame and punishment. In religious context, in some religion context, it will be associated with the act of confession. And it then goes a full cycle of being redeemed and basically going back and being able to repeat exactly the same behavior again.
Yeah.
Whereas shame has a completely different pathway.
Yeah.
Because you engage with something that you want to know more about or learn or change, you might be confronted by shame because it challenges some assumptions, some ideas that you've had about the world or anything. But it's not per se about right and wrong. So it's not within a frame of blame, it's in a frame of creativity, experimentation, curiosity. In the process of learning, you can make mistakes. You might feel shame about them, but if you're working within this framework of learning, then you will be able to learn from those mistakes. So they will take you somewhere new. They are mistakes rather than deliberate acts of maleficent.
Yeah, so what I'm understanding from what you're saying between shame and guilt is that shame can be transformational, and if you recognize that's what you're experiencing, whereas guilt is more around you've done something and that's made you feel guilt. However, just because you feel guilt doesn't mean you necessarily change your behavior.
Correct.
So you might end up repeating it and again. And I guess that what really triggers for me is something that's hovering around in my mind is, if we were looking at shame and guilt, is one more, I'm going to use this word, I can't think of another, attacking than on ourselves? Or are they just different things that manifest for us?
I think that's a really interesting question. Your area of expertise is very much around working with diversity.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking the notion of white fragility. I think we're trying to understand the role of a white person in relation to race and discrimination generates guilt. I think, don't you think, will you agree, Nita, that when it generates guilt, it generates a defensive behavior? So
Yes.
perhaps the person will be talking about it in a particular way, which to me often sounds almost luxuriating in their feelings of guilt and therefore drives a particular behavior which is actually not helpful and not really changing the status quo. And I wonder whether that's where people become frustrated. And whereas if or when people recognize the role of whiteness in their context and what it has done to other groups of people, and they feel shame around that, which is not personal necessarily, they can engage in a conversation and work through that in a different way.
Absolutely.
Would you agree to that? Has that been your experience?
I think so. I think, yes, I do think that somehow within the work that around this area around diversity and inclusion is, if we can connect with it in the way that you're describing, not from a place of guilt, but from a place of shame, and saying this is a part of a learning experience, and it's not you personally, it's a societal context that we're all in, I think you can move from it. My sense is that sometimes we get stuck around the guilt part and we don't move forward with it much, I think. So I think that's a really great example. One of the other sort of questions I want to come back to is around, is shame universal?
Yeah, I think so, but I can't claim to have met all cultures in the world to be able to say it's universal. I think that's a bit of a big word. Possibly, probably it's human, and humans are humans, but because it's also culturally and societal dependent, then perhaps it manifests differently in some places as opposed to others. But I think you can usefully think about the dynamic of shame and analyze inter countries politics and inter global dynamics using that as one of the things. I think that would be an exciting next step of working with the application of this understanding of shame as a part of the collective, maybe part of the collective unconscious. I think shame is, if you work it with shame, then it's healing. If you work with guilt, then you get stuck. I do think that we have examples around that, and in various parts of the world.
As we bring this amazing subject to close, what would be one or two things do you think an individual can deploy in terms of their strategies around managing shame for themselves?
I think it goes alongside with empathy and compassion. And I think one thing to remember, which we don't always remember, but if we are not able to have empathy and compassion to ourselves, we don't really have it for others. And I think a lot of people in the jobs of the type that you and I do think that they're above those feelings, or they should know better, or they shouldn't. How come they would be affected? They wouldn't readily admit on a recording like you just did before that you had to start from owning your own shame, for example. So I think that's one place to start, and then remember that it is relational, and therefore we can't do this on our own. We can't, in fact, do anything completely on our own, nothing. We are social creatures. We are always dependent on others, so there's no real shame about being dependent. Obviously it can go to an extreme, and it can be malfunctioning, but ultimately we are all interdependent creatures, and if we try to rise above this very basic quality, then we will lose the essence of life almost.
Absolutely. And I think what you're saying as I get older is the interconnectedness with people.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it is about reaching out and just connecting with people who, in whatever circumstances, you feel that you can share things with, good as well as not so good, I think. And I think it's okay to be interdependent with others. I think that's it's a very powerful lesson that we can learn about ourselves. And I also like what you're saying around compassion, self-compassion. And a lot of people will say, I'm very compassionate towards others, yet I'm not compassionate towards myself. And so I'm really interested in that. How can we be compassionate to others but not ourselves?
I don't think we can. I think it's an illusion.
Okay, that might be a wonderful subject, Eliat, for us to talk next time, because I'm sure people will go, what does she mean by that? Because having been on many self-compassion courses, I've heard many individuals who are in the helping profession say, I'm really compassionate towards others, but not myself. So be interesting to explore, are we that way towards others? I don't know. It's a provocative question to ask, really. But I want to thank you so much. I've learnt an enormous amount through our conversation today. And I just think it's given me really more food for thought around how I observe the world and how I connect with the world. So thank you.
Thank you, Nita. Thanks for having me.